Hello and welcome to Things We Said Today, our weekly podcast about anything and everything to do with the Beatles as a group, as solo artists, past, present, and future sometimes, if we have some info. I'm Alan Kozin, the author of The Beatles From the Cavern to the Rooftop, and got that something, how the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand changed everything. And I'm joined by my regular co-hosts. You know Ken Michaels as the host of the syndicated radio show Every Little Thing. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Alan. Hi, everyone.
And you know Steve Marinucci as a writer for Axis.com, Billboard.com, Variety.com, Goldmine, and various other places, reporting on the Beatles, the Monkees, and all kinds of other things, and also is the author of a book, Meet a Monkey, Davy Jones. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Alan. Hello, everyone.
And this week we're going to sort of pick up where we left off on part one of our mono and stereo show. And we're picking up with Rubber Soul. And I think we're not going to get to every single minute difference if it's a matter of fading 2 seconds early on one version, or on the other hand, if it's fading 10 seconds early, which we do have a few of this week, we'll do that. But, it's funny because, I don't know, I spent a lot of time sort of listening to some of these things today and, and also reading people who have spent a lot of time cataloging some of these differences, and there are things that I heard that weren't cataloged, and there were things that were cataloged that I just don't hear. There were things that, where someone said the mono has more of this than the stereo, and listening to it, I thought the opposite. So, this is a wonderful game everybody can play, and the stereo and mono are now plentifully available, both on CD, on LP, and it's actually a lot of fun to go through all the tracks, and we're going to point out some of the more interesting differences in the second half of the Beatles catalog. So, does anyone want to start here? Ken?
Well, with Rubber Soul, Drive My Car, to me, the biggest difference is that in the mono mix, you don't hear the cowbell as much as you would in the stereo. That's the main thing for me. I mean, in general, when you listen to the stereo Rubber Soul, the one thing that I kind of dislike when you talk about stereo, as I said in the previous show, I'm not a big fan of lead vocals in one channel, and you have that throughout most of Rubber Soul.
Right.
With the exception of, say, Think for Yourself, which has George in both channels, or What Goes On, which has Ringo in both channels. You do have the background vocals, the harmony vocals, in both channels. So it's not as harsh to me hearing lead vocals in one channel. But you could say that throughout Rubber Soul, since the first two albums, which we pointed out, you have that on both albums. Rubber Soul is a lot like that in that regard.
Yeah. Just
in general,
It is. And when the first four CDs came out and I interviewed George Martin about the whole stereo mono business, we talked about Rubber Soul. And you can actually read that interview on a site run by Steve. It's still up there, right? On the Abbey Road site?
Oh,
the
yeah.
Abbey Road site.
Yeah, and the Abbey Road, it's on abbeyroad.net. Yeah, it's still there.
Okay. And what I had asked him was, since he has been on record as seriously disliking the first two albums in stereo for exactly the reason Ken just described, why was Rubber Soul so much that way? And I mentioned that I had heard that, they were down to the wire on Rubber Soul making it, and it was, in danger of being late, so maybe they had to mix more quickly than they would have liked to. And he said, no. You see, what we were doing was we were experimenting. We were trying to come up with a mix where you could make one mix in stereo and fold that down to mono. and that would give you both the stereo and mono mixes without having to make separate mixes. And he said, and we found that if you put the vocal in the center, once you combined the two channels into one to make the mono, the vocal was 4 decibels louder than if it was only on one side. So that's why they were doing it on one side. Now, there are a number of reasons that this argument doesn't make a lot of sense to me, first of all. One is that he disliked the stereo mixes of the first two because they had the vocals on one side and instrumentals on the other, but he's okay with this because it's experimental. But the result is exactly the same. And the second thing is, there are so many instances on Rubber Soul where the mono and stereo are so different. You know, they're quite obviously separate mixes, so that whole program, I guess, failed, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, but hey, the wonderful world of the Beatles.
But I also think that there's a difference between listening to them on headphones and listening to them, you know, through speakers.
Right.
Sure.
At least for me. I mean, I think I can handle the vocals on one, the instruments on the other, out of speakers. But when you're listening in earphones, it's become, and I haven't always been this way, but it's pretty. I can't take it now. I just don't like it. It just does not sound good. You know, when you're close in like that, it just doesn't make sense. And the whole thing, and a lot of those early mono stereo mixes don't make sense for that reason, which is the difference. And I kind of noticed this, you know, today, and when I was listening today, in the later mixes make a little more sense. Not necessarily a ton. I mean, it's not an overwhelming, you know, thing, but they seem to make more sense to me. I don't know. Do you guys agree with that? Is that me just talking off the top?
The later mixes where they centered the vocals, are you talking about, or?
Well, yeah. I mean, the later stereo mixes, yeah. As opposed, and the mono mixes themselves, and the mono mixes too. Taken together, I think everything works a little better than it did originally. And I don't know, you know, that's weird, you know. But
yeah.
Maybe they were, you know, maybe what you said about experimenting, you know, maybe at that point, because they weren't really experimenting, that was the difference, you know. That was the big difference. But
you know, in general, we've talked about the differences between the whole mono versus stereo experience. And, you know, there's something to be said about stereo despite having vocals in one channel. You know, there's more of a presence that you feel overall when you listen to stereo. It can be very satisfying listening to mono, and it's a solid sound. And certain things, you know, Rubber Soul can be very satisfying listening in mono for me. But at the same time, because it's one solid sound, certain things I feel have more, maybe it's mixed a little bit hotter or have more presence in mono. Like, for example, and this is just my ears, but like, think for yourself, the fuzz box, the lead guitar has more presence to me in mono. You know, I don't know if you feel that way. Or the piano in You Won't See Me has more presence in mono. But that's my ears. So
yeah,
I don't know how you feel about that, but
I think there's definitely a case to be made for that. Especially, I mean, I used to notice that on the early songs. There were a couple of and I guess they'd be gray market Japanese releases back when we had the first 4 in stereo that had a lot of the first 4 in mono that had a lot of those same songs in stereo, and you could hear the presence. Maybe it was just a thing that you were missing because you were missing hearing the stereo on those songs, but there was definitely a presence there. Anyway,
I like that you can pick apart the instrumental textures easier if you can, you know, have two different sound sources. I mean, even if the vocals are centered, it's still easier to hear in some ways what's going on in stereo. But but the mono, those are great tracks. I kind of like having them both. Let's put it that way.
Well, yeah, I do too, and there's no question that, speaking generally now, when you get to Pepper, especially Pepper, not so much the White Album, because the White Album is a discussion on its own because of the mono White Album. That's where I became really familiar with the mono stereo differences. Mm-hmm. But Pepper, especially when you listen to the mono Pepper from the White CD box, it's like, amazing. I mean, the power of those mono mixes is amazing. It's incredible. Mm-hmm. And that said, I mean, that's why, I mean, we've had this discussion about mono versus stereo. We had it on the last show, but I mean, I think that propels the argument that the mono mixes were, in some respect, what they wanted. Although I know you were saying last time that it isn't as much true as probably we've always thought it was. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah. So moving on through Rubber Soul, I should mention our two big sources for these, apart from listening ourselves. I've got I dug out the old pamphlet version of Mitchell McGeary and William McCoy's Every Little Thing. They then did it as a book-length thing for Period Press, or Pop Culture Inc., which became Pop Culture Inc. I really kind of like the pamphlet version, but it came out in 1976, and so there were a number of things that actually were not available in stereo as of 1976, and so it's not complete, but it's really good. And the other is Joe Brennan's website, which I can't remember the name of the website, but if you Google Joe Brennan, it's Brennan, you're bound to find his. Do you have it, Steve?
You're talking about the Usenet Guide to Recording Variations?
Yes, that's exactly it.
There's also the Beatles Anomaly Guide, or Anomalies. There's also that too.
Right.
That's another good and free resource that everybody should have. There's also this thing that I discovered, and I'm not even sure how available this is, by Michael Todd, called I'll Get You. It's basically the same thing as what Lewison has done, where he lists every recording date and lists all the tracks that were recorded.
But I don't think he gets into the anomalies, does he?
No, he doesn't. Yeah. He doesn't get into the anomalies. The anomalies is yeah. And then there's another book, and this may be tougher to find. It's called The Beatles Mixes by Holger Scholler and Thorsten Schmidt. And I don't know where I got this, but it lists unfortunately it lists the songs in alphabetical order, and it lists the mixes track by track, or the different mixes separately. So for example, with Honey Pie, it has mono 1, stereo 2, and those are from the UK mono and stereo white albums. Mono 3 is Argentine and Brazilian mono white album. Stereo 4 is German white album. So, I mean, and this is not recent. So I'm trying to see what year this is. 2000. Yeah. So this is like 17 years old. Mm-hmm. So, but there's another book to look for. Plus, there's the three Podrazik Castleman books that we talked about on the last show. So there's a lot of resources out there.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The Castleman and Podrazik don't get into mono stereo differences either too much, do they? I don't think so.
I think they get into it a little bit. Am I wrong there? It seems like I do remember reading about those in there.
Yeah.
But
okay.
But not as extensively as McGeary and the other sources do.
Yeah. And McGeary and McCoy do theirs alphabetically too, and Brennan does his by basically recording date. So, and we had started Rubber Soul sort of, in track order with Drive My Car. So we may skip back and forth between those two methods. The next one I have here is Norwegian Wood, which has a couple of interesting anomalies, including coughing sounds on after the line, told me to sit anywhere. You can hear it, but you really kind of need headphones, and that's in the mono. Oddly enough, you would think that something like a cough you could hear better in stereo, but in the stereo mix, they seem to have pulled the fader down after told me to sit anywhere, so you don't hear the cough. And yeah, that for me was the main thing. Brennan also mentions a second thing, whereas just as the vocal begins, she told me she works in the morning and started to laugh, that there's you can hear someone saying "sounds good." Right, and it might have been George, because it was right after the sitar, the little sitar bit there. And Brennan points out that you can actually hear that on a bootleg where George's track is separated from the rest. And he hears it in the mono mix. I don't hear it. I tried with headphones. I didn't hear it there, but he does, so give it a try for yourselves and see what you think. And, the only other thing to say about that is, it's not just mono stereo, but when they remix that track for Love Songs and for a European album called the Beatles Ballads, they move the vocal to the center where it wasn't in the original mono. It was on one side. Anyone have anything else on Norwegian Wood?
No.
Okay.
Not me.
Steve, you got anything?
Are you talking about? We're still talking about Rubber Soul. There's several things. There's the longer fade out on Michelle in stereo, which I think you don't want to get it. I think we didn't want to get too much into those.
Let's say if it's over 5 seconds, we should mention.
Well, Run for Your Life is 9 seconds shorter in stereo, which is and I'm trying to remember the source where I got that, because I have a long list here.
Steve Hoffman has one.
Is that the one? I'm not sure where I got this list from, but yeah. Mm-hmm. So there's one right there. There's a bunch of longer fade. Did you mention the additional guitar part at the end of What Goes On?
I did not, but yeah, that's a big one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, and that's only in stereo.
Right.
So now there's an instance where I think it's better with that guitar finale in that song, which sort of is an argument. Okay, it's only one track, and so many instances of mono things being better than stereo, but this is a case where the stereo sounds finished and the mono sounds unfinished. Mm-hmm. Just because of that little guitar figure at the end, it really kind of needs that little guitar figure, and when you hear it in mono without it, it just sounds incomplete.
Yeah, it adds something at the end.
Yeah,
definitely.
We could also look at, while we're in Rubber Soul, there's not too much different in We Can Work It Out, but Day Tripper has a few different mixes. The U.S. mix was different than the U.K. mix, stereo. And, the differences have to do with things like double tracking. One sounds double tracked, one doesn't. Not so much of a difference between mono and stereo, except that in stereo you obviously can hear that guitar drop out, which you don't really hear in mono because it's mono. You hear everything else going on, and it disguises the drop out a bit.
Right.
Okay.
So that may do it for Rubber Soul and Rubber Soul Era.
Actually, we didn't mention I'm Looking Through You.
Oh, that's right.
The stereo one has the false intro.
In the U.S. only.
Right.
Well, now all these things are international, right? Because they put out the U.S. albums on CD. Anybody can get them anywhere in the world. So, but back in the vinyl days.
Mm.
It was U.S. only.
But wait a minute now. Without listening to without having the U.S. box in front of me, didn't they use the remastered versions for that, Alan? And
Not for that. No, I
They
think
did?
where something was clearly different, they used the actual U.S. stereo mix.
It's been so long since I've listened to that U.S. albums box, partially because I don't particularly care for it.
Yeah.
Um,
But plus,
but
in the original U.S. albums boxes, when they put it out as two boxes and only made it as far as
right,
Rubber Soul.
the Capital Mixes boxes did that.
Yeah.
That or Capital Versions boxes. That's definitely true. They did do that. So
Although when it first came out, there was a pressing error where instead of having the mono and stereo mixes, they had the stereo mix twice. So you got that. I think you got those false starts in stereo and in mono.
right.
So there's a collector's item, like people collect stamps with misprints. This is a CD that you need to get.
Well, they actually had people, I believe, send them back in,
Yeah,
as I recall at the time.
yeah. But
Some
the
people-
press copies came out that way, and
Right.
I kept mine. So
Yeah, they didn't have us send them back in. Thank
no.
goodness.
Yeah.
But so yes, I remember all the discussion about that. Okay. Anyway,
Also, Day Tripper is longer in the mono mix, and the fade out is longer.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So on to Revolver. Who wants to
Yep.
start there? Steve?
on the opening track on Taxman, the cowbell starts at too small in mono, but in stereo it doesn't start until Yeah I'm, which is I guess isn't but I mean it's a difference that you're going to notice. So, but it's one of those weird things, So, but there's a start of it right there.
Okay.
So,
Ken?
Yeah, that's it for Taxman as far as I know, but I'm Only Sleeping has differences in the backwards guitar bits between the mono and the stereo.
Right.
And the mono, not only is the main solo in the middle somewhat different, but you actually have a few moments where you hear some backwards guitar while there's vocals.
Mm-hmm.
In the mono, that is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then isn't the version that's on Yesterday and Today different also with the backwards guitar?
Well, so there are basically four mixes of I'm Only Sleeping. There's the mono that was sent to the U.S. for Yesterday and Today, and then Capitol made a fake stereo mix from that mono mix. So the original Yesterday and Today release in stereo was just the mono mix in fake stereo. Then there was the stereo UK, and there was the mono UK. And then there was a fourth mix. And the fourth mix was another U.S. stereo mix around, the early to mid 70s. Capitol, in some cases, apparently not all cases, some plants seem to have, when they repressed Yesterday and Today, they substituted the fake stereo tracks with real stereo tracks. But for some reason, the real stereo track they had for I'm Only Sleeping was different from the UK stereo track. If that's not confusing enough, there is also a talk of a French EP that has a different mono mix with the guitars coming in at different places. But Brennan, in his analysis, says that he's listened to them both, and he feels that the French mix, so-called French mix, is really just the UK mono mix. And he does this thing. I mean, this is another reason you should check out his website. He has listed for each verse where the backwards guitar comes in on each of the mixes. So that is excellent work, I have to say. So, yeah.
Okay.
So
this is getting complicated.
Okay. So let's continue with the Revolver. So, looking at the chronological list, the first thing that they really started for this was Tomorrow Never Knows for Revolver, and Tomorrow Never Knows is yet another special case because that had first of all a mono mix that came out and was then withdrawn. The original British Revolver mono had a matrix number XEX606-1, and that version is now known as the Matrix 1 version, right? And that has a completely different mix of Tomorrow Never Knows that's kind of worth seeking out because it really is so strikingly different. And the biggest difference really is at the end. There's a lot more piano going on that you don't hear on either the standard mono or stereo mixes. And there were some other little differences too in terms of how loud the vocal is compared with the loops and other effects and things. And they must have just reconsidered what they wanted out there and substituted the next time on the next pressing, which was another XEX606, I think 3 or something. No, 2. 606-2 and 606-3. So
that's a shame because that I love the end of Tomorrow Never Knows, and it would have been more fascinating to hear it have a longer fade out.
yeah, with a lot of jangly piano.
Yeah.
Also, in the standard mixes, mono and stereo, one of the big differences that always struck me is that in the second verse, I think it is, where John is singing "Love is all and love is everyone." Right in the beginning of that, you hear on the left channel a feedback whistle in the stereo version, and
yes, you do.
You go to mono, it's not there. So it's just one of those fascinating little things,
I never noticed that. So.
After all the times you've listened to Tomorrow Never Knows, there's still new things to hear.
That's the great thing about the Beatles. You always learn something new.
So whose turn is it for the next track?
What is the next? What have we gotten to? Well,
Love You Too.
Love You Too. There's a longer fade out in mono. I'm not sure how much longer it is.
It is 13 seconds. That is a monster long fade out.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm looking at Brennan. My printout is not great, but it just says it doesn't say how many seconds. Where did you get 13 seconds
from Brennan?
Is it Brennan?
When I read it in Brennan, and then for each of these things that I read in any of the sources, I then went back to the tracks and made sure that it was correct because I don't agree with all of everything everyone has said, and like I said, there were some things I heard that haven't been cataloged. So, yes,
my version is very old, and it's possible that he updated it, and I don't have everything that you do. But in any event, so where are we going now?
Here, There, and Everywhere?
I noticed a difference in Here, There, and Everywhere that I haven't seen cataloged anywhere, and that is that in the mono version, at the very end, when they sing that last line, Here, There, and Everywhere, and then it comes to an ending, along with their singing, there is a descending guitar line, the guitar using a volume pedal, that you hear in mono, you don't hear in stereo. It's a really nice touch, and it's missing in the stereo version. Steve?
There's also a backing vocal saying "I'll be there" in the stereo, but not in the mono.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another difference.
Okay. Can you have anything for that?
No, I never noticed any differences between the mono and stereo of that song. So,
Okay. So let's move on to
Yellow Submarine.
Okay, well, Yellow Submarine, big difference in the
Um,
very first note.
Yeah. In the mono version, the guitar starts the same time that Ringo sings.
Hmm.
But in the stereo, it starts on the word town.
Right.
And also, when John says "a life of ease," that's missing in the stereo mixes, the early stereo mixes.
Hmm. And here is yet another interesting thing. When the Yellow Submarine song track was done, I talked to the guy who mixed that. This was before they got Giles in. And he said, you know what I try to do is I try to recreate the mono version, but in stereo. So where John comes in late, I have him come in at the same time he came in mono. And I said, well, okay, this was before the record actually came out. We did this interview, so I hadn't heard it yet. And I said, okay, what about the opening guitar chord? Do you have that? And he said, well, no, I didn't do that. Now, he didn't explain why he didn't do that, but then Giles, on the one album, did exactly the same thing. His mix is very different than the Yellow Submarine song track mix, but he does bring John up again, you know, where those lines are missing in the original stereo, but he too left off that opening guitar chord. Don't understand the rationale for that. Any theories?
Just so we have another mix that's slightly different that we have to have.
Yeah, but if we're going to have a stereo version of the mono mix, we want that guitar chord there.
Yeah.
You know? I think maybe they felt that because Yellow Submarine, apart from being a single, was also a movie, and the movie used the mix without the guitar chord, they probably felt that everybody sort of thought it begins that way, that's how it should begin, and didn't want to cloud up the issue with a guitar chord. I guess. It's not a very good theory, but it's the best I can do.
But then if the single was mono, more people heard the single when it was a hit.
That's right.
And then that had the guitar at the beginning.
Right, exactly. That's why it's not a good theory. Okay, so moving along. Let's see. Mine are still in chronological by recording, so got to get you into my life.
Oh, the
Okay.
big thing is really the ending there,
Yeah.
which goes on for another 5 seconds, but you hear vocals from Paul
Mhm.
that you didn't hear before.
That's right.
You know, it's and you got to listen. Well, you should listen with your headphones on, because when you're so used to the stereo version where it fades, it's really exciting to hear an extra 5 seconds at the end.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Let's see. Oh, Dr. Robert, I mentioned last time. Dr. Robert was the track that made me realize that some of these differences are really big. And the difference there really is the chorus vocals and the way they're mixed. The well, 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 you're feeling fine. The way I'd always heard it on the US mono and stereo that I grew up with, and even pretty much the British stereo, you just hear, well, 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 you're feeling fine. On the UK mono, along with that, there is a sort of like a descending, backing vocal that's like, well, 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 you're feeling fine. It's a completely different line that is just lost in the stereo mix and the US mono mix. But the first time I heard that, I thought, wow, that's like a whole part of the arrangement that I haven't been hearing. So what else is going on? And then just went on a mono binge, listening to all the mono discs that I hadn't listened to since I replaced them with stereo. And that
Wow.
There's also supposed to be maracas on the US mono that aren't on anything else.
And the US mono also has, at the very end, you can hear John saying, "Okay, Herb."
I
Anyone
know.
figure out who Herb is, or is it just John calling someone by a name,
Probably just John
Yep.
mouthing off to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's no engineer that I know of with the first name Herb. So,
Right.
yeah. What about "And Your Bird Can Sing"?
Yeah, I don't have anything for that. Do you?
The guitars are supposed to be mixed louder in the U.S. version, in the mono,
I see.
and the stereo is supposed to be the same level.
Okay.
It's been a long time since I heard the U.S. version, so
Right.
There's a different stereo mix on the anthology DVD.
Well,
For
yeah,
what it's worth.
different mixes of lots of things on pretty much everything on the anthology DVD. They went back and among other things, made them 5.1. So then, shall we move into Pepper, or
I think so.
The Pepper era, starting with Strawberry Fields?
Actually, no.
No,
We need to
missed
do
one out?
Paperback Writer, and Rain.
Okay. To me, the only differences were pretty much the power of the mono mixes compared with the stereo mixes. But anything else?
In Paperback Writer, yeah, towards the very end when they're all singing Paperback Writer, there's a lot more. It just sounds like more effects, more echo effects, and there seems to be this one beat on the drum that I hear from Ringo that I don't hear in the stereo at that moment. And also, Paperback Writer is a little bit longer, the mono version.
Okay. Steve, you have anything?
No.
Anything on Rain?
Rain does seem to be. There's the effects seem to be different on Rain. I'm just going from memory now. I don't have any notes in front of me, but it seems to me that it is different. But like I said, I don't have any notes in front of me. It just seems that way. I don't know.
Okay. Perhaps people can listen to it and write in.
Yeah. I mean, they absolutely they should.
Yeah.
And again, let's point out that we're not doing every single, we'd be here, for years going through every single, variation. There's just no way we can do that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think it also makes sense for us to talk about things that are strikingly different since we're not playing them on the show. At least we can say what the differences are, and people can go listen to them on their own. Mm-hmm. So with Strawberry Fields, there are actually 4 mixes of that thing. The original UK Parlophone single and the US single were the same mix. Then there was a stereo mix that came out on Magical Mystery Tour. Then there was the so-called German stereo mix. That was, those first mixes were done in 1966. The German mix was done in 1971. And then the fourth mix, another 1966 mix, touched up in 1995 for the anthology. But to me, the big difference, apart from the fact that there's like a lot of detail you can hear in stereo, like you can hear, some counting, before sections or to be joined. I think not the 1 minute join, but there are things where there's a cue for something else to come in. You can hear someone counting. In I think the German stereo mix, I don't remember hearing it in any of the others, but the big difference between mono and stereo is that in stereo, he says cranberry sauce twice, and it fades out before the second one in mono.
That's very important to know.
Sometimes I feel a little silly saying these things, but this is what we live for,
right? We'll talk in detail about that if we ever do a Paul is Dead show.
There are people who are convinced that John is saying I buried Paul, but to me it's clear as day that he's saying cranberry sauce. But
right. No, I agree with you there.
Yeah, the fact that they slowed down his vocal, kind of makes it a little more mysterious. I always used to think he was saying I'm very bored. But then when you hear it at the actual speed, it's really clear what it is. So But I love Paul's explanation of that. Where I think I don't know if it was in the anthology or someplace else, but he said, "Yeah, it may seem strange that he's saying cranberry sauce, but if you know John, you know that he's likely to say something like cranberry sauce at any time."
Right.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. So, into Pepper itself, what have you guys?
So nothing about Penny Lane.
I didn't hear much difference apart from obviously the promo trumpet ending.
Right.
What do you hear?
I don't hear any difference at all.
Well,
I was wondering if you guys did.
No, alas.
Yeah, unfortunately. I mean, we have the bootleg versions, but you're right. No, there isn't a whole lot. I mean, that the mono version, I like the mono version, and I really wish that they had put that promo trumpet on the release single rather than just give it to the radio stations. That's too bad.
Yeah.
But
he decided he didn't want it, and so had it withdrawn, and that's his prerogative.
That was Paul. That was Paul.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And it's an interesting prerogative, just to have it end with the sort of feedback, rather than, the trumpet ending was a very natural ending. I think it was kind of a semi-avant-garde decision to dispense with it.
That's a good point.
So I'm continuing chronologically. So for me, the next thing with a difference is Mr. Kite. And the difference there is that the tape loops in the sort of, crazy break where, the loops have been thrown up into the air and rejoined and played at different speeds and backwards and forwards. They're a bit different in mono and stereo, and it's hard to say which has more because, Brennan says that I think he says the mono has more. But I listened to them both, and, it's just that you're hearing different things. I kind of thought the stereo had more in some ways, so at least it's a difference. That's all we need to know.
Mm-hmm.
So pick a track, any track.
How about Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds?
Okay. Some big differences.
In mono it's a little bit slower. Mm-hmm. And John's vocal has a flanger effect in it that you don't hear in the stereo mix. It's more spacey. Mm-hmm. That's the big difference there for me.
Yeah.
When Giles did the remix last year, that was the first thing I noticed because it really stuck out in the new stereo mix. Because you were used to not hearing it, and then it was there, and that was one of the things I really, really loved about that new Pepper version was that.
Yeah. So that was probably one of the few mono stereo mix differences that I had heard even before running into that Dr. Robert thing. I remember getting the stereo Pepper when I exchanged when I got rid of all my mono albums originally and got stereo, and being a little disappointed that the stereo Lucy in the Sky didn't sound as spacey as the mono one. I probably borrowed my mono back from my little sister, who I gave all my mono albums to originally, to hear what the difference was and seeing that it was the effects, the flanging or phasing. But, and I just thought, okay, I guess maybe in stereo it didn't work quite the same way, but there's a track that sounded much better in mono, and now it's nice to have a stereo version that has that effect on it.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. I
don't know. I'm very partial to the stereo. That's just me for the whole album. So
yeah. Within You, Without You, the big difference, I think, really is just the laughter at the end. It's different in mono and in stereo. I think it also comes in a little earlier in one or the other, possibly earlier in stereo. It's also, I think, a bit louder in stereo, and in mono it's a bit more subtle. I mean, it's still obviously laughter at the end of that heavy philosophical track, but it's much more out there in stereo.
Okay.
All right. There's the big difference in She's Leaving Home. Different speeds. The mono one is much faster. I've been so used to the stereo one. It's the one that I prefer. But since the Beatles, their first priority was mono, that's the way they wanted it. Was the faster version. So
the information I have here says that it's actually a different key, which is quite a difference.
Well, that's what happens when you make it faster.
Right. Well, I mean,
it's like half a step.
Yeah. So, well, isn't it more than half a step if it's a different key?
No. In this case, in stereo, it's an E. In mono, it's an F. So
right.
It's half a step.
Right. Okay. I thought it was a full step, but okay.
I kind of like it in mono. There is yet another difference that I heard as a kid when I switched from my mono pepper that I originally had to a stereo. It just sounded weirdly draggy to me in stereo, and it had never seemed draggy at all in mono. It just sort of, went along at a really good clip. And, even though it's, a string score, and you could argue that the song is, slightly on the gooey side because of the strings, if you're inclined to say that about things with strings on them, which I'm not necessarily. But in that case, once it got slowed down, it was like, well, what happened? Where's the energy that song had? So yet again, I think Giles made a good choice there to do, the mono speed, but in stereo. Good work.
Okay.
Deserved
a
Grammy.
I think
really?
Since She's Leaving Home is a sad song, it makes sense. I think it emphasizes that more if it's slower. I don't know. I just think it's more powerful as a slower song.
Okay.
But that's just my opinion.
No, right. that's a good point.
So. And then the only other track I have different on Pepper that I can think of is the Pepper Reprise. Which, the very beginning where they're all around the mic, just, chattering, much louder in mono than in stereo, and you still can't really hear what they're saying, but that, I don't think what they were saying was the point. I think that was all about vibe, right? And that was much clearer in mono. I always used to think there was an extra bar of drum beats in the mono intro, but listening to it again, it's actually not. But yeah, and also, of course, the connection from Good Morning to the Sgt. Pepper Reprise is different in stereo and mono.
Right.
So we talked about some of this stuff when the Pepper album came out. So, or the reissue.
Yeah, I have trouble with that little guitar break.
Yeah.
That goes into the Sgt. Pepper Reprise, with just like a split second where it's like dead air. Yeah. And you feel like it's a mistake. At least I do anyway. But, I'm so used to the stereo version where it's a much smoother transition. Yeah. So.
I didn't hear it so much as a mistake as, kind of the equivalent of studio chatter. It's like, okay, we're picking up the instruments, getting ready to do this. That was just the way I heard it. But
yeah.
Okay.
And then also at the end of the reprise, you've got Paul screaming at the end.
Yes.
There's some stuff in the mono that you don't hear in the stereo.
Yeah, or you can barely hear it.
Yeah.
But, and that, again, that's vibe, right? We can't tell what he's screaming, but it's just exciting, It's like in a live show where, someone's up there screaming at the end of the song, and it just sort of was a nice touch that kind of went missing in stereo. Yeah. I love all the differences in mono and stereo on Pepper, especially, because they're all, they're all really significant. I mean, you got key changes, you got things not quite hooking up on one, like that, guitar that morphs into a chicken and that works on the other, and all these things are, and Paul's screaming on that, and the group chattering before it. It's so many touches to keep track of. It's a great thing to go back and forth between mono and stereo with.
Well, there was so much happening there. I mean, that's why it makes more sense for this kind of stuff to be happening now than before.
Yeah.
That's what's so interesting. So.
Okay, let's move on to Magical Mystery Tour. Ken, you want to start with the title track?
I didn't notice any real differences there. I mean, I didn't see any major difference until Blue Jay Way for me.
Oh, okay.
Did you guys hear a difference in the title track?
I don't have anything in the title track myself. Do you, Steve?
Not recording wise. I know that the video is different, but no, not on the recorded version, not on the record versions. No. Go ahead.
Well, you know what? I did notice one thing about Magical Mystery Tour, and that's, for my ears again, Paul's lead vocals, I think, are a little more distant when he sings the Magical Mystery Tour is hoping to take you away, that part.
Mm-hmm.
It just seems it's not as upfront to me as in the stereo. So, it's a slight difference there.
Right.
Okay.
Steve, do you want to pick up the next one?
Well, it depends on which next one we want to hit.
Yeah.
I'll go with Blue Jay Way, which there are no the backwards vocals are missing in the mono.
Yeah.
But they're present in stereo.
It has a whole different feel that way,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think on the current version with the remix of the soundtrack on the video, they're using a stereo version without the backing vocal. The mono one normally doesn't have the backing vocal, but now they have a stereo remix that also got rid of the backing vocal for the video. So
Okay.
Wow.
So many different mixes floating around there. It's hard keeping.
No
track
kidding.
of them all. Yeah.
No kidding. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. On Your Mother Should Know, what I have basically are just some sort of phasing effect differences. In mono, there's a bit more phasing than there is in the stereo one. But other than that...
Paul's vocals sound a little bit different, maybe because of the phasing, or in mono, that is, on that song. Okay. I think so, anyway.
Yeah. We'll continue with the side A stuff. Walrus has a bunch of differences.
Right,
yeah.
Right. If you count the rarities version with the extra stuff in the middle, there's extra stuff in the intros. I mean, there's all sorts of weird things going on. Differences floating around on that thing.
Yeah.
If you just go by the UK, go ahead, Alan.
What they did is they combined various of the versions that were out there into a version that just sort of had everything. And yeah, there's the intro, in mono it's a 4-beat intro, but in stereo it's a 6-beat intro. I think I have that right. I don't think it's backwards.
Yep.
Right.
And then in stereo, apart from having the 6 beats in the intro, they also have a longer section, in the middle where, things begin to change and get a bit crazy. There's a little bit of a few bars of sort of orchestral. That section is a little bit longer in stereo than in mono. So
right.
What they did is it's just kind of crazy because there were so many different mixes going on, including they always had to use the one that had the radio stuff put into it because that couldn't happen again, if they wanted to have that Shakespeare. So, but the rest of the track is edited differently for different mixes and gets that gets a bit confusing.
Yeah. What I find really interesting about I Am the Walrus is that if you listen to the mono version, there are two times when the first two verses end and John is singing I'm crying, and then you've got two beats after that. And you hear, like, I think it's a cello that does the two notes, that da 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 da. And in stereo, Ringo does a fill underneath that.
Right.
In mono, you don't hear drums at all. At both those points in the song, there's no drums there for those two beats each time.
Yep.
I remember one of the bootlegs. I think it was the Purple Chick. I think had the radio thing, the full radio BBC, not the. I mean the unadorned radio part that's in there.
Yeah.
Which was interesting to hear. That was the first time I remember hearing that. So. Anyway, okay.
So then on to side 2. We already did Strawberry Fields, but there are differences in Baby You're a Rich Man, which is, about 10 seconds longer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another one
in the mono.
Sorry, mono's 10 seconds longer. Also, originally the US version was fake stereo. Sounded really kind of mediocre. Then the German, another 1971 mix for the German version, really brought out the bass. And I remember getting that thing and putting it on and hearing it not only in stereo, but with a really three-dimensional bass line. It goes way down there. And then was so stunned by that I took out the Capitol one again and played it just to make sure, my memory was correct. And yeah, it just sounded terrible by comparison.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's All You Need Is Love.
Absolutely.
Which is longer. It's longer in mono. That's the main difference for me.
Right.
That's a big... Okay. There's also some differences in the intro. So on the mono, you can barely hear the drums, and you can barely hear the piano. In stereo, they're very clear. The mono does have a longer fade by, I think that's 10 seconds or so, and you hear Greensleeves for a second time.
Right.
But in stereo, about half a minute in, you can hear someone shouting out, check. In stereo, it's not in mono. It's gone. Kind of weird, things like that seem made to be mixed out, and it's kind of funny what doesn't get mixed out, and they must have listened to it and said, no one can hear that anyway. Just left it in.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny hearing all that stuff from the live broadcast that we didn't that they pulled out, and that's something they didn't pull out, which is, really, that is rather obvious. That it should have been pulled and it wasn't.
Yeah,
so
it's like the broadcast one has in the intro has a tambourine instead of a snare drum.
Right.
And I believe also in the orchestration of the live one, they quoted an old song, one of those old standard, "In the Mood."
Right.
And that had to be removed because it was in copyright, and where Greensleeves wasn't.
So.
Wonder what would happen if that kind of... Well, obviously, it would probably be different now if they had, done it at this point in time.
Yeah, it may be out of copyright by now. I'm not sure.
Right.
But,
right.
Yeah. All right. So this brings us to the end of 67, and it looks like we're running out of time before we even got to the White Album. So we will continue with the White Album at a future time, because there actually is an awful lot of difference between the stereo and mono White Album, and when we were growing up, we didn't even have a mono White Album because it didn't come out in the U.S., only in England,
right.
or Europe too. But here we had only stereo White Albums, so we had to catch up with that later.
That's right.
And
when was the mono available here in the U.S.?
Only as an import.
Right. I remember going into a vinyl record store in Berkeley, and I actually found either one or two mono discs. I can't remember now. I know I found at least one though in their bargain bin. It was like, wow. Huh. And that was the first time I'd ever heard it. So that was kind of cool. But
so we will pick up with that. If not next time, then on a future show. It will be relatively soon, I believe. And before we go, I guess we'll just sort of go around and let you know how to get in contact with us. Steve?
You can write to me at BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. You can catch me, as many people have, on the Facebook group Beatles News and Information, where I hang out and post Beatles stuff. Somebody asked me about the Coda releases that are on Amazon and on Amazon UK. I don't know if you guys are familiar with those. These are the public domain things, and they have quite a few of them. Right now, actually, both Amazons don't have too many of them. They have the vinyl ones, but not the CDs. But basically, it's all gray market stuff. I mean, the sound quality on them, from what I understand, is good. But I mean, if you're a collector, you have everything that they've put out. There's no reason to get it unless you really need to have everything. But in any event, so that's just one question that I answered this week, and I thought I'd mention that.
Okay.
So, okay.
And Ken?
You can reach me by email at everylittlething@att.net. Also, my website is kenmichaelsradio.com. There's Beatles trivia every single week, which starts every Monday, runs through Sunday. You can win one of 9 prizes every week, and there will be another special contest on the website that will start later in the week, probably Friday or Saturday. Not sure what it is yet, but to get a jump on it, it would be a good idea to check the website towards the end of the week. Again, that's kenmichaelsradio.com.
Okay, and the easiest way to get in touch with me is on Facebook at either Alan Kozin or my alter ego, Alan Kozin Remixed. We all read the mail at thingswesaidtoday.radioshow@gmail.com. And sometimes one or the other of us will answer it. So feel free to write. If you have something interesting and compelling, we'll read it on the show or deal with it one way or another. And so, this has been a...
This has been a crazy show.
Yeah, really. So,
and we're not done. And we're not done.
Yes, we are.
So
we should just say a big thank you to all of our listeners who listen to us, whether it's on Podbean or iTunes or YouTube, because in just 2 to 3 days, we had over 1,000 downloads on Podbean alone.
Yeah.
So that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
That's
so
good.
Thanks to you guys for listening and for your support, and spread the word about the show.
Yep.
Okay, so for Ken Michaels and Steve Marinucci, this is Alan Kozin saying thanks for listening and catch us next time.